And I think the big takeaway here is that we can't expect that nuclear deterrence will always function exactly as how we predict. And doing so risks overconfidence in our own ability to control escalation.
That's the voice of Matt Korda, Senior Research Associate and Project Manager for the Nuclear Information Project at Federation of American Scientists. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshare Spun podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome back to Press the Button. Hi, Lauren. Great to see you again. How was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. It's good to see you. My weekend was lovely. Spent it hanging out with some family, some of whom celebrate Easter because they're Catholic. I know that's a big week for holidays with Easter yesterday, Passover, Ramadan's happening, and then Orthodox Easter next weekend. So happy holidays to everyone listening, regardless of which holiday you're celebrating. Tom, how was your weekend?
It was very nice. I took a long bike ride out to the Bladensburg Waterfront Park. For anyone who lives in the D.C. area, it's a nice place to ride your bike to or drive to or whatever. It was a beautiful day here on Saturday. And not only is it a nice waterfront area, but the region had a role to play in the War of 1812. So they have all of these historical postings around about battles relevant to the War of 1812, which is a war I don't know near enough about. So it was very educational to go and read all the historical postings. And then, of course, they also, because it was the day before Easter, had a little Easter celebration going on, which included something that I had never seen before. You know how on Christmas they have the Santa person dressed up as Santa and the kids sit on their laps and tell them what they want? Well, they had the same thing with the Easter Bunny, which I just thought I'd never seen.
That was your first time seeing the Easter Bunny in real life, Tom?
It was an interesting experience. And then, of course, they had a big field where they put all these Easter eggs out in the field. And then they had a countdown and about 100 kids all stormed onto the field. It was a lot of fun. Anyway, so shifting to fun Easter things to the nuclear news update. War in Ukraine, sadly, brutally grinds on. During a speech at Georgia Tech on Thursday last week, CIA Director William Burns warned that military setbacks and potential desperation could prompt President Putin to use tactical or low-yield nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And it's as if in response the next day in a CNN interview, President Zelensky said Russia could use either nuclear or chemical weapons at some point during the war. Just a small editorial comment here on the CIA Director Burns's comments. The terms tactical and low-yield nuclear weapons get thrown around a lot. But just to clarify from our perspective, tactical nuclear weapons may be low yield or high yield. The tactical just means that the weapon is a short range one for use on the battlefield. But the destructive force of the weapon itself can be anywhere from 1 kiloton to 10 kilotons to 100 kilotons. So quite large. And just for comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was about 15 kilotons. So just because something is tactical does not mean it's necessarily small. And then in response to reports that Norway and Sweden are considering joining NATO, Moscow said that it would be forced to strengthen its defenses in the Baltic region, including by deploying nuclear weapons in the area. Interestingly, the Lithuanian defense minister claimed that Russia already has nuclear weapons stored in its Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad, which borders Lithuania and Poland. But we have not been able to independently verify that claim. There's some confusion about that, so we will keep watching it. Then switching to Iran, the Iran nuclear negotiations are still deadlocked over the issue of whether the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. We've been talking about this some time on previous episodes. The United States is reportedly holding off on sending a counterproposal to Iran. In other words, to make a counteroffer to what Iran has said so far. If this is true, this would imply that the Biden administration is letting political concerns about this designation get in the way of reviving the nuclear deal itself. That would be a huge setback for peace in the region and efforts to keep Iran further away from nuclear weapons. So we'll just keep tracking that and keep you up to date. And now for early warning, what do we have coming up, Lauren?
For early warning this week, Alex Hall is joined by Monica Montgomery, the advocacy coordinator for the Council for a Livable World. They discuss the Pentagon budget and what it means for our priorities.
And then I sit down with Matt Korda at the Federation of American Scientists, and we discuss India's recent accidental missile launch into Pakistan. You know, this was a truly terrifying incident. It didn't get a lot of attention because most people are focused on, understandably, on the war in Ukraine. But this incident could have been much worse if things had gone differently. Both sides got tremendously lucky in this situation. This is a great lesson about the dangers of accidental nuclear war, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Monica Montgomery, advocacy coordinator at Council for a Livable World and research analyst at Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Welcome, Monica.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Debate is heating up on Biden's 2023 defense budget. What did Biden originally propose when it came to nuclear weapons policy, and what are we seeing now reflected in the defense budget?
So during his campaign, Biden pledged to maintain a strong, credible deterrent while reducing reliance and excessive expenditures on nuclear weapons. We saw similar language in his original interim national security strategy once he came into the White House. As a candidate, Biden said he will pursue a sustainable nuclear budget and that the United States does not need new nuclear weapons, particularly in that moment, we believe referencing the Trump administration's proposals to develop some new low-yield nuclear weapon systems. I think overall, it would be fair to say that the Biden administration is failing to live up to this pledge. The top line for the fiscal year 2023 budget is over $813 billion for national defense, which is kind of a massive number. When we look at the number of the requests for nuclear weapons spending, combining both programs in the Department of Defense and also in the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, Biden is requesting $50.9 billion for nuclear weapons spending for fiscal year 2023. This is a $7.7 billion increase, or nearly 18% over just last year alone. We see major increases in most every nuclear weapons modernization program, including the new intercontinental ballistic missile, the new strategic bomber, the new nuclear submarine, and its submarine-launched ballistic missiles. We don't have the full budget documents actually out yet. We're still waiting for the NNSA and the DoD to put out more detailed budget documents, but we've seen massive increases in the top line level for the National Nuclear Security Administration, and we'll believe that the warheads associated with a lot of these modernization programs will see big bumps as well. The only cuts that we actually see, and we haven't seen them yet, we have only heard of them through press releases and media, is that the new Sea-launched cruise missile, a low-yield nuclear weapon that was proposed by the Trump administration, as well as the last megaton gravity bomb in the U.S. arsenal, the B-83, will be retired, and plans to develop the Slickerman will be cut by this administration. But otherwise, this budget essentially proposes to move forward with every single nuclear weapons modernization program put forward by the Obama administration, carried on by the Trump administration, including two controversial programs, the W-93, which is a new sub-launch ballistic missile warhead that's moving ahead of schedule due to it being pushed forward in the last years of the Trump administration, as well as a low-yield ballistic missile warhead, the W-76-2, that was developed and deployed under the Trump administration as well.
So you've outlined here for us a number of programs and weapons developments. What are the most contentious issues here, and who are you watching in Congress at this critical time?
So the decisions to cut the Slickerman and retire the B-83, I believe, will be the most contentious issues related to nuclear weapons in Congress this budget cycle. Republican leaders of the Armed Services Committee, like Representatives Rogers and Lamborn and Senators Inhofe and Fisher, have already pledged to raise the top line even further and to push back on the administration's decision to not move forward on these programs. I think it's going to be a contentious battle. Our cause is not helped by members of the Pentagon, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and Head of U.S. Strategic Comm, Admiral Richard, talking about their difference of opinion with Biden on this program. Both in recent hearings have said that they believe that we should move forward on a slick amend and not retire the B-83, not because of really any new reasoning or explanation, rationale for developing these weapons, but because of their kind of mantra that is every nuclear weapon is better to have in our arsenal. In this case, particularly for the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, we don't believe that's true. Just possessing this is actually blurring the lines between conventional nuclear warfare, cuts down on the conventional capabilities of attack submarines that would carry these nuclear missiles. And it is not something that actually makes our deterrent stronger because it's a nuclear warfighting weapon. So Democrats, I think, will be pretty united in this battle, though it's hard to predict how it's going to go. It's going to take quite a bit of oxygen, I think, up on the Hill to hold the line on both of these systems. And unfortunately, that distracts us from the bigger nuclear weapons issues that we face. Questions surrounding the new intercontinental ballistic missile, whether we should move forward on developing a new one instead of extending the life of the current missiles, whether we should develop 400 of them, which seems to be this holy number that no one can really explain why we have to have that many, why that's the one set in stone. The question of the new submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead, the W-93, questions surrounding the need to develop completely new plutonium pits for nuclear weapons, about declaratory policy, about sole authority. There's so many other questions that are really important about nuclear weapons and that Congress should be looking into and debating. But when there's these kind of side issues put in by the Trump administration, the Slick Amendment, the W-76-2, keeping the B-83, they require most of the attention and oxygen that our community and Democrats and our champions on the Hill can use, and distracts us from making bigger reforms in nuclear weapons policy.
We're in the middle of an ongoing pandemic. The cost of living is increasing for so many. This is a lot of money that we're talking about for issues that, as you outlined, take us away from the broader question, what truly keeps us safe? How do you encourage people to get involved on this issue? And what can they do to have their voices heard when it comes to these issues in Congress?
Absolutely. It's an important question because no matter how much work we can do in Washington as experts and advocates, our message must be backed by the message of people across the country, constituents, and members of Congress districts to make change on this happen. The situation in Ukraine has brought nuclear weapons back to people's minds, or for the first time in a long time for many people around the world. We're looking at nuclear weapons and Putin's threat to use them as a very scary moment in the world. The question about whether nuclear weapons will be used in this conflict or whether they prevent the United States or other actors from being able to intervene and help Ukraine has been really important to realizing the threat that nuclear weapons still pose to the world. So I think this provides a great moment to talk to members of Congress to get involved in this issue. Further, as you say, we're in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. The cost of living is up, inflation is up. We're told that oftentimes spending on domestic programs, social spending, necessary tools that we need to rebuild our economy, to make our country more equitable and just for all is too expensive. However, why is it that the Pentagon gets a blank check every year and we never ask, oh, why is $50.9 billion for modernizing every single nuclear weapon in our arsenal, many of them outdated Cold War weapons, not too much? So it's an important moment. You don't need to feel like you need to be an expert to be talking to your members of Congress about this issue. Simply saying, I think we spend too much on nuclear weapons. I think we should have fewer. I think we should not spend as much on the Pentagon and put more money into necessary social services, healthcare, education is all that you need. Don't underestimate the power of writing, calling into meeting with your congressional representatives to talk about this, joining into local or national grassroots movements that are pushing back. They do have the expertise and the tools that you can use to push back against this growing arms race that we're facing right now.
Thank you so much, Monica. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but it's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Alex.
Hi, my name is Chase Enright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues. because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
While the world was focused on Russia's war in Ukraine, we had a reminder in South Asia of just how easily the world could stumble into nuclear war. On March 9th, India launched a cruise missile into Pakistan by mistake. Now, as listeners know, India and Pakistan possess more than 300 nuclear weapons between them and have faced multiple military clashes. Luckily, this incident did not escalate into a more serious situation. The missile was unarmed, the launch happened at a time of low tensions, and amazingly, no one was injured. To help us understand how the accident happened and how it could have spun out of control into a more serious incident, we're joined by Matt Korda. He's a senior research associate and project manager for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, and he recently wrote a report on the situation called Flying Under the Radar, a Missile Accident in South Asia. Matt, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Matt, missile launched by accident from India to Pakistan. How did this happen? And, how did India explain this situation?
This story is absolutely wild. There are a lot of conflicting details flying around as well. So it's been somewhat challenging to get a clear picture of what really took place on the evening of March 9th. But using a kind of a combination of official and unofficial government statements, satellite imagery, social media, and local news, I've tried to do my best to kind of piece together what I think is a relatively accurate picture of events. So what we kind of know is that on the evening of March 9th, a northwestern mobile command post of an Indian BrahMos conventional cruise missile unit was undergoing a routine inspection, and somehow a single missile was accidentally launched. And according to Indian defense sources, that means that a series of software locks would have had to have been bypassed, and 2 manual keys would have had to have been inserted in order to initiate the launch countdown. And so it's kind of unclear at this stage whether or not those actions were pre-planned as part of an exercise, or whether or not those particular officers took some kind of unauthorized initiative. But in any case, it's clear that the missile was never supposed to have actually been fired. So upon firing, the missile traveled in a southwesterly direction around a speed of Mach 3. I'm kind of parallel to the India-Pakistan border for nearly about 100 kilometers before it turned northwest and crossed the India-Pakistan border. And so then it kind of continued on that same trajectory until it crashed near the Pakistani town of Mian Chanu after a total flight time of approximately 7 minutes. And so according to Pakistani military officials, about half of that flight time took place within Pakistani airspace, and the total distance traveled was about 124 or so kilometers. And so, as you mentioned in a press conference afterwards, Pakistani military officials stated that the object was unarmed, thankfully, and that no one was injured, but they noted that it did damage some civilian property, and we saw some images of how widespread the damage actually was.
Has there ever been a situation like this before where one nuclear-armed nation launched a missile by mistake at another?
I actually wasn't aware of this before, and I had thought that this was a completely unprecedented event. And Stephen Schwartz, who's a senior fellow at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and a fantastic resource on nuclear history, subsequently informed me that in September 1986, a Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile armed with a dummy warhead misfired during a scheduled test, and it flew about 1,500 miles off course and landed in northeastern China. Somewhat incredibly, there was I think a Newsweek article that came out at the time where US Pentagon officials told Newsweek that the accident was what they called the sort of thing that could happen to anyone, which is pretty wild. Whomst among us has not accidentally launched a nuclear missile at another nuclear armed country? But on top of that, there are also a lot of examples of missiles landing in non-nuclear armed states or other types of broken arrow incidents involving accidents with nuclear weapons. But to my knowledge, a nuclear armed state accidentally launching a missile at another nuclear armed state is incredibly rare, and from my understanding, has not taken place before in the context of India-Pakistan relations.
Well, I guess we should count our lucky stars that it's incredibly rare, but at the same time, it makes it incredibly disturbing that it happened at all. And, it seems like India and Pakistan in this case got, as we said, extremely lucky, right? Unarmed missile, time of low tensions, nobody injured. What in your view could have happened if events had gone differently, particularly given the past history of conflict and distrust between India and Pakistan?
Although the accident itself was a massive error, as you say, things could have been much, much worse, right? So the incident took place during a time of relative peacetime between the two nuclear armed countries. But, as you mentioned, in recent years, India and Pakistan have openly engaged in essentially conventional warfare in the context of border skirmishes over disputed territories. So, in February 2019, for example, India conducted a cross-border airstrike into Pakistan in response to a suicide attack in the disputed regions of Jammu and Kashmir. And then Pakistan subsequently conducted airstrikes back into Indian territory and actually captured an Indian pilot. So overall, there was a really tense situation there. And then in late 2020, the situation escalated even further when Indian and Pakistani troops exchanged gunfire along the line of control, resulting in reportedly at least 22 deaths. And so those skirmishes would be, I think, really concerning, even if both powers didn't also have nuclear weapons. But of course, that adds, this extra layer of concern. During the 2019 crisis, for example, Pakistani military officials even convened the National Command Authority, which is the mechanism that directs the country's nuclear arsenal, directly as a kind of a signal to India. And at the time, the spokesperson of the Pakistan Armed Forces told the media, I think they were trying to be coy or something. They said, "I hope you know what the National Command Authority means and what it constitutes." And of course, we know what it means, right? It has a direct relationship with the country's nuclear arsenal. And it's a clear piece of nuclear signaling, really not unlike what we saw a few weeks ago when Putin publicly kind of commanded his strategic nuclear forces to begin what he called the special regime of combat duty regards to the invasion of Ukraine. So, just kind of similar types of signaling going on in both contexts there. I think it's also worth noting that after the missile launch was detected, the Pakistan Air Force suspended all military and civilian aircraft for nearly 6 hours and reportedly placed frontline bases and strike aircraft on high alert. And it remained that way for the next couple of days. And Pakistani officials appeared to kind of confirm that. They took what they called tactical actions in response to the launch. And that was taken even after I think it was relatively clear that the launch was accidental and that no further launches were imminent. So you can only imagine if this same kind of accident had taken place in the midst of one of those border crises that I mentioned before, or some kind of future similar incident, or if the incident had resulted in civilian casualties, which very thankfully it didn't, you can really easily imagine how the situation could spiral out of control.
Now, what about the possibility that this missile could have run into a civilian aircraft or something like that? I mean, you could have had a situation where hundreds of civilian casualties resulted. Was there a danger of that in this situation?
It was clear that because it was an accidental launch, India didn't issue a notice to airmen, right, which is kind of the customary thing that most countries will issue if you're about to conduct a missile test to try and clear all aircraft from the skies right before you're about to do that kind of launch. Because it was an accident, India didn't submit a notice to airmen. And as a result, there were quite a few civilian aircraft in the area of the launch. And Flight Radar 24, which is a website that tracks civilian aircraft movement, they put together a little time lapse showing just how many aircraft were in the area at the time when the missile was flying. And it, again, just as we were saying before, we're extremely lucky that it didn't hit anything or didn't result in any kind of casualties, because the possibility was definitely there.
So clearly they got lucky. We all got lucky. These are the kind of things that aren't supposed to happen with nuclear weapons, but yet sometimes They do. Do we have any sense that India or Pakistan have learned anything from this? And what do we want them to learn from this?
Something that to me was particularly notable about the incident, and something that I kind of highlighted in my report, was the clear deficiency of India's immediate response to the incident. Right after the launch, there are mechanisms in place for India to alert Pakistan to what's going on. There are high-level military hotlines. There are these other mechanisms. Pakistani officials said that India made no attempt to contact them either through these military hotlines or through other means. And then additionally, on top of that, India waited 2 days after the incident before issuing a short and pretty vague public statement about what happened. That has some pretty serious implications for crisis stability. And I think, we should commend Pakistan in this context for acting with, I would say, relative restraint. I would suggest that this is maybe an opportunity for folks in Indian military officials or political leaders to examine why there was no attempt to use the military hotline, if indeed that's true, and no attempt to really contact Pakistan in this moment of crisis, and also why it took them so long to make this public statement after the incident. And so I guess that kind of points to their external communications being somewhat poor, but it looks like internally, India is taking some positive steps. The Indian government convened a court of inquiry to investigate the incident, and the preliminary ruling has found more than one individual guilty of violating standard operating procedures. And so there will be presumably some kind of consequence there. Although it's still unclear whether or not that report is going to be released publicly, it seems to me that at the very least, it should be released in some form to Pakistan as a method of improving transparency and rebuilding confidence between the two countries to demonstrate why this incident isn't going to happen again, right? That kind of thing. Additionally, Indian news sources are also reporting that they're revamping their kind of standard operating procedures for storing missiles and launchers and for conducting those kinds of inspections. And apparently there's a new set of error alarms that have been brought in, and then also some alterations that have been made to strengthen the software and hardware locks that are needed to launch the missiles. So those are all really positive steps, and that's great to hear. Something that I did also highlight in my report, though, is that there is some concern about Pakistan's ability to track the missile correctly while it was in flight. On several occasions, as well as during their first press conference on March 10th, Pakistani officials appeared to misidentify the missile's launch point and some elements of its trajectory. And Indian officials then subsequently stated that the kind of public trajectory map of the missile's flight that Pakistan released to the media was wrong. And, that I think should be taken with some grain of salt because, there could be some kind of political gamesmanship going on there. But if that is true, then that could also have really significant implications for crisis stability, because perhaps in a different context, Pakistan could miscalculate or misunderstand the missile's target and be pushed towards rapid retaliation. If it is the case that they weren't able to track things correctly, I think that should be examined as well.
My understanding is that the BrahMos cruise missile is not typically nuclear armed, but is conventionally armed, although in this case, as we said, it wasn't armed at all. Did that have an impact here? In other words, did they have less safeguards or controls placed on conventional weapons than nuclear weapons? In other words, should we expect there to be greater safeguards on nuclear weapons?
The public reporting that I've seen indicates that because the BrahMos is a conventional weapon, it doesn't have the same kind of self-destruct mechanisms that we've seen or that are reportedly present on specifically nuclear systems that are deployed within India. So perhaps there was that kind of one less layer of safeguards. That's something to consider as well.
Interesting. So India has self-destruct safeguards on their nuclear armed missiles, which is interesting because the United States does not, right? The United States, if we launch a nuclear armed missile by mistake, it's gone. There's no calling it back. And it's interesting that India does have that on there. That's interesting. I hadn't realized that. So zooming out a little bit, let's talk about what this might mean for the rest of the world and what the rest of the world should be thinking about nuclear weapons and the risk of nuclear war. In particular, is there anything we should be learning as we're looking at the risk of war in Ukraine?
Just because the missile itself is most likely a conventional missile, the crisis can illuminate pretty dangerous dynamics that can come into play when we think about crisis escalation between nuclear armed states, right? So whether that is India and Pakistan, or whether that is Russia and NATO in the context of Ukraine. I would say that the most important thing that it emphasizes is that accidents can always happen, even in the context of nuclear crises, or perhaps especially in the context of nuclear crises. And it also reminds us that, luck absolutely does play a role in preventing crises from escalating further, right? Like we talked just in this conversation, I think we mentioned, 5 or 6 different elements that prevented this crisis from harming anyone or from, escalating beyond the situation that it was, right? So this is a really important point. And again, this is something that can play out both in the South Asian regional context, or whether it's between, a nuclear crisis between Russia and NATO. And Zia Mian and MV Romana just put out this great piece in Scientific American on exactly this topic about, how luck and institutional design can contribute to accidents or crises escalating. And I think the big takeaway here is that we can't expect that nuclear deterrence will always function exactly as how we predict. And doing so risks overconfidence in our own ability to control escalation. This has implications for how countries structure and posture their nuclear forces. In the report, I point out that in recent years, India's rocket forces have increasingly placed emphasis on trying to achieve a higher level of readiness, resulting in a shift towards canisterizing their missiles and possibly pre-mating missiles with their warheads. And in recent years, there have been several former civilian and military officials in India who have suggested that some portion of India's nuclear force, and particularly the weapons that are designed for use against Pakistan, are kept at such a high degree of readiness that they are capable of being released within seconds or minutes in a crisis instead of hours, as many had previously assumed. And so you can see that India is taking these steps towards increasing the readiness of their forces. And that development is probably causing some kind of mirror imaging in Pakistan as well, and prompting Pakistan to increase the readiness of its missiles and to tighten up its own launch procedures. And when you put these two things together, you end up with the possibility that crisis stability could be significantly eroded, and you could really raise the likelihood of nuclear use in a regional crisis. Because, if Pakistan believed that India was considering a comprehensive first strike, then Pakistan might be tempted to use nuclear weapons first, right? So it's in this context, it's really easy to see how crisis stability between India and Pakistan might already be, on a knife's edge. And with both countries increasingly postured for conducting rapid nuclear strikes, I would say that accidents like these really underscore the need to build in some kind of resiliency measure so that things don't spiral out of control, right? So with that in mind, this crisis could provide some kind of opportunity for both India and Pakistan to really collaboratively review their communications and crisis procedures to ensure that future accidents prompt diplomatic responses instead of military ones.
Matt, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your time and look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Bishop, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.